Afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Leonie Hicks from Canterbury Christchurch University, and I'm approaching this from more of a, Ty described me as an archaeologically friendly historian. So I do feel a bit of an interloper, but hopefully I can add something to our discussions. So the starting point for my paper really is something that had been bothering me about historical and archaeological approaches to the Norman past, and the Norman past very broadly conceived, not just the conquest. And that is the lack of attention paid to descriptions of the landscape in chronicles, of which we have a large number associated with the Normans. And my topic, my project particularly, sorry, is that someone's phone? Sorry, Lindy. So my project, which I've been working on for the past 10 years and really do need to sit down and just write it now, looks at chronicles associated with the Normans in Normandy, starting with Dudo, the earliest of our Norman chroniclers, going into England and also southern Italy and Sicily, particularly Marta Montesino, Geoffrey Malaterra and William of Puglia. And these writers use the landscape to present ideas about society and the construction of past in a very sophisticated manner. And one of the things that has been sort of driving me mad, if you like, is the willingness of scholars, not just historians, but others as well, to dismiss these landscape descriptions as tropes, saying, oh no, they just belong to the classical past. All we've got here are variations on the theme of a locus Aminus, the beautiful place, or a locus horribilis, the terrible place. And then there's the sort of flip side of that, which is particularly for the conquest, and particularly for the example that I'm going to talk about, following on nicely from Anya's paper, which is actually the rebellion and the harrying of the north, is people have tried to actually use these chronicles to plot itineraries and to plot the campaigns. That isn't really possible, and the fact that people still insist on spending a lot of time trying to do that is perhaps, or is wholly, in fact, missing the point of what these chroniclers are trying to do. Now, where does the archaeology come into all of this? My primary background is as a historian. That's what my doctorate was in. I was based in the history department. I was supervised by a historian. My examiners were historians. I work in the university history department. However, I also have a background in field archaeology, and have some practical experience, and I currently teach between the history programme and the archaeology programme at Christchurch. And what I found was sort of growing out of previous work that I'd done on the use of space in Normandy in particular, was thinking about the lack of attention paid to the use of the outside, and the Normans seem to have been an outside sort of people, or peoples, I should say, and actually sort of start drawing on my archaeological background to ask questions of the chronicles, particularly what are we seeing? And seeing taken broadly, and hopefully this will help explain that. So seeing broadly, seeing in terms of spatial acts, seeing in terms of construction of landscapes, seeing where the people are and what they're doing within the landscapes and how this is framed by the chroniclers. So that's, if you like, my rough schema of what I'm attempting to do. That is the mess that is currently my book and the inside of my head, but simplified down to here by beginning to look at descriptions of the landscape. We need to do some quite interesting things in terms of thinking about links between landscape description and the frameworks that not only we as historians and archaeologists and others use to interpret that, but some of the frameworks that our chroniclers were working in. Now, we have to start from the principle that these chroniclers were experts. They were experts in the Bible. They knew their Bible backwards. So there are liturgical and biblical aspects to these descriptions which we need to bear in mind. Work by Charlie Rosier and others has been gradually untangling the links between chroniclers within monasteries and the office of the cantor, the person responsible for liturgy, the person responsible for time, if you like, in the monastery. So we need to think about how that fits in. So this sort of, if you like, sort of fits into the northeastern section of my diagram, think about it in terms of the points of the compass, the sort of liturgical perception, worldview and experience of the chroniclers. Down this side, we've got our modern ways of thinking about the landscape archaeologically, theoretically, historically, and literally. And drawing on that, we also need to think about relationships between where we derive some of our ideas from, what we owe to landscape traditions of the past, the classical tradition, the romantic tradition, the English landscape tradition, and so on, which has been wonderfully elucidated by Matthew Johnson, among others. And also think about what the landscape allows us to see that we lose sometimes in our other sources, particularly movement and visibility. So visibility, movement, people, layers are all key. Now, I've referenced the work of Matthew Johnson and his ideas of landscape, which came out around the time that I started on this project, has been quite influential, although it's also quite problematic, as often the best things are. In Ideas of Landscape, as many of you will know, Johnson laid down a challenge, particularly at the English landscape tradition and its approaches as created by O.G.S. Crawford and W.G. Hoskins about, this was empirically driven, it was embedded in ordnance survey maps, it was predicated on going out and getting your boots muddy and thinking about what you were seeing based on the map. Johnson challenges us to think more about how that seemingly unchanging landscape as represented by an ordnance survey map shifts, depending particularly on things like temporality, seasonality. What do we see out if we go out at different times of year? Ditch the map, look with fresh eyes. So I've sort of tried to ditch some of the baggage that comes with being a Norman historian and look at my examples with fresh eyes. And there's one that is very close to home. I can see the cathedral from my office in Canterbury and see Belharry Tower. And I normally get in at this time of the year, just as the sun's still coming up, about 8 o'clock. And what the tower looks like throughout the day, it's been there for centuries. It's been part of that environment for centuries, but it changes and it highlights different things. You can pick out different details on the tower and on the cathedral, depending on the light. So this is sort of a very practical way of trying to think about some of the problems. So as well as Johnson, I also draw on some of the cultural geographers, particularly Yves Tuan's idea of topophilia, less relevant perhaps to the Harrian of the North, it's more topophobia. And also Doreen Massey's idea of space being a simultaneity of stories so far. If you like, all these stories that we tell about the Normans and their activities existing in the same place at different times and building on that and drawing on different things. And I want to come back to that point towards the end of my talk, drawing on our discussions this morning. So I did have a plan, and this workshop has actually been so helpful because now most of what I want to talk about, I'm going to actually try and draw on what we've been thinking about. So let's try and think about the Harrian as a way of putting this into practice then. Hopefully there's a map. Yes, good. It seems a bit daft to put a map of the rebellion and the Harrian in York. We're all quite familiar with the geography, but it does help. Right, so Audric Vitalis is our starting point, who probably took his description of the rebellion and the Harrian from the now lost part of William of Poitiers' Guest of Guelmy. And this account really underlines the complexities of medieval chroniclers' understanding of place and landscape, and the intertextuality, if you like, the copying from one to the other, the differences between the two. Now, William of Poitiers was writing in the 1070s in Normandy, so he was geographically removed, but he was part of the ducal household and had access to people who knew what had been going on. Orderic grew up in just outside Shrewsbury, and he was born in the 1070s. This was an area that had been affected by the events of 1068 to 70, but he was packed off to Normandy aged 10 to become a monk, so he is both geographically and temporally removed from what's going on. And as I said, he was probably, though we don't know for certain, using William of Poitiers' lost ending or lost bit of his chronicle. So Orderic, as we know from other parts of his chronicle, and some of this has been elucidated by Amanda Jane Hicks in her book, had a very good understanding of his environment in the southern region of Normandy, based around his monastery at Canterbury. He had a good grasp of geography in that region and a good grasp of sacred geography of the Holy Land from his experiences as a monk. And he seems to have known Rouen very well. But when we turn to the description of the harrying, you think, what's going on here? Right, so we get lots of detail about perhaps where William travelled. He tells us about the buildings that were constructed on the way, particularly the castles. You can see those, the yellow. He tells us about some of the topography. And the nature of the landscape proves as challenging to William's army as the activities of the rebels and their Danish allies. And what we need to remember is that this is not an itinerary. It's not, this is what happened, he went there, he did that, he killed these people. But it's a sophisticated way of explaining how William needed to establish his authority over this territory, which was necessary to hold in order to maintain his throne. So the difficulties relate to, on the one hand, his enemies' perceived use of the northern landscape, which was significantly far removed from William's centre of authority in the south. Rivers are especially crucial, either as natural barriers, difficult obstacles, or boundary markers between different territories. So the Humber estuary provided shelter for the Danish forces in 1069, and a natural barrier beyond which they could retreat to the inaccessible marshes. Inaccessible marshes is Orderic's term. And of course, the Humber estuary was much more marshier than it is now, because although the reclamation started in the 11th century, they didn't really gather pace until the 12th, as all of you know better than I do. So it's a different, it's a soggier landscape. Other rivers proved difficult to negotiate. Let's just switch to the River Aire, squiggling along at the top. The River Aire was neither fordable nor safe for navigation, apparently. And on reaching Pontefract, where William encountered the river, this held up the advance of his army quite considerably. The rivers Aire and Calder are tricky rivers. They were made much more navigable by canalisation during the Industrial Revolution, and even now when they're in flood, they are significant hazards. But there were crossing places, both at Castleford and Ferry Bridge, based on the Roman roads and so on. William was unwilling to build a bridge because stopping and building leaves you exposed. It leaves you exposed to anybody who can come up behind you and pick you off. And this fact is significant because elsewhere in the chronicles, William of Poitiers, so remember Orderic's probably using William, gives us descriptions of the battles of Varaville and Valais-Dun in 1047, Varaville in 1057 in Normandy, in which the rivers were a great help to William. particularly Varaville, washes the French king away, with the French army away, and the French king has ended up, separated from the rest of his army on the other side of the river. So there was an awareness that this was tricky. So rivers were obstacles to be treated with caution, showing good military leadership here, and also as a way of demonstrating commitment and the loyalty that William inspired. So we are then told that l'Histoire of Poitiers scouted around for a while, for a couple of weeks, to find a safe crossing point. The other thing we need to take into consideration is William's marches along roads. Now, we don't know the routes that William took. Capel, based on this account, speculated about William going actually westwards along the Aire Valley, crossing the Aire much further west of Leeds, then coming back over the Pennines and going to York. But as he was coming up sort of that way, that's a very circuitous way of getting to the heart of the rebellion, it seems to me. And why Capel speculated that this was the route is due to this description. We've got woods, mountains, valleys, narrow paths, marshes, mountains, and so on. That is the route, the sort of overhead from Pontefract to Nottingley towards York. Sort of Roman road going that way. It's quite flat. I can't see a mountain range, and I grew up in this area. So there's obviously something going on here. We cannot take this at face value, nor should we. It's an attempt to really big up William. Look how wonderful he is. He's just like, he's better than Julius Caesar. On the return march, which comes back through Chester, we get... Actually, the army was complaining because the weather was awful. It was winter. They all wanted to go home. But William was like Julius Caesar, and he was steadfast. And Audric, incorporates that. Elsewhere in William of Poitiers' chronicle, and I'm sorry that we have to keep switching between the two. It does underline the difficulty of using these sources. Elsewhere in William Poitiers' Guest of Guilherme, he goes on about what a brilliant person William was in comparison to the poor unfortunate Julius Caesar, who couldn't hold a candle to our great and glorious Duke and King in terms of military leadership. So the landscape here is underlining the separateness of the territory. And this is where we sort of need to pick up on some of the things we were talking about this morning. It's a local conquest. It's part of a bigger narrative, but it has local detail that we must be sensitive to. And it exists alongside our archaeology. It's not a competing narrative. It's not in conflict. It's a way of explaining. It's a way of understanding. So to pick up on Alex's idea of how we're going to disseminate all this wonderful stuff that we're talking about, is there not a case with our public history and archaeology hats on and thinking about our apps? Yes, we include the buildings, we include the find spots, but we also include these other stories and say, this is how the conquest was imagined and reimagined in the minds of near contemporaries and those writing a generation afterwards. I don't want to end by saying William of Poitiers and Audric Vitalis were somehow phenomenologists and psychogeographers. But if we're thinking of a modern parallel, then that's what we're dealing with. Thank you. Thank you.